I've made tons of videos, and perhaps the most rewarding and gratifying videos I make involve taking the time to sit down and have a candid conversation with pillars of the industry who've done so much for all of us throughout the years. Usually I would sit down and talk to programmers or the folks who created companies, but this time I wanted to break away from that and take the opportunity to talk to someone who we knew by their voice alone. Growing up, I never played Halo, but I remember distinctively hearing the sounds of the multiplayer announcer throughout the years, simply in passing or watching my friends play Halo together. The man behind the voice is Jeff Steitzer, a kind gentleman who agreed to sit down and talk about his history in the arts, and more importantly, the franchise we all know and love, Halo. Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre, and today I have the luxury of sitting down and talking to Jeff Steitzer. Did I pronounce it right that time?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. Who's a major pillar in the video game industry for a voice that you might be familiar with hearing, such as Kilimanjaro and Ultra Kill, or if you're a little bit older, you might remember some of his other creative works, such as Pajama Sam, one of my favorite games from my childhood. But how are you doing today?
I'm very, very well indeed. Thank you.
Sounds like we've had this conversation soon. For anybody who doesn't know, I goofed, just like for Ken Williams, where I accidentally hit the space bar, reaching for my phone to check on the time, and it canceled the recording about 14 minutes in, and we were having some riveting discussion about
we'll have more
about his creative stuff. We'll have more, yeah. So I wanted to break the ice asking about where you're from. You're from Deadwood, South Dakota, and I wanted to ask
Deadwood,
just
South
how many
Dakota.
times you were conned into going to a field trip to see Wild Bill Hickok run through the streets.
Oh, I didn't have to be conned. I loved it. Because I grew up in an era when Warner Brothers Television had something like 8 or 9 Western TV shows on. They were still being made. Movies were. John Wayne was still a big deal. Most kids of my age at that point were still really into Westerns. So to go to Deadwood, which I had to do because I was born there, we moved out of Deadwood when I was 6 months old. I have, of course, no memory of that period. We lived in Sioux Falls for 6 years. Then we moved to San Diego, California, where the family lived until I was 11. I'm the oldest of 5. Then we moved back to Iowa because my dad had a chance to get his own dealership. He was a car salesman. And yeah, although he'd always wanted to be a radio announcer, a sports announcer, in fact. And we would go and visit because he still had friends he and my mom both had friends in the Black Hills. My grandparents lived in Aberdeen, South Dakota. My uncle lived just outside Aberdeen, ran the farm. My cousin was there. So we used to visit all the time. We'd make a couple of trips a year. And every once in a while, we would go a little bit further and go out to Deadwood. And that was a highlight. My dad actually did something at one point. He tried to get me, he was going to pay someone to get me on the jury because they picked the jury from the people who are watching. And I was too young. In fact, I think I was on my way up and they asked my age and I told them, I said, "Oh, sorry, you're not old enough to serve on a jury."
You're not
So I
able
had
to send someone to death.
skulk back, and my dad was furious. But I thought that stuff was great. And in fact, the woman who played Calamity Jane was Randy Latimer, is her name. She was the daughter of a couple that my folks were great friends with, had been since they were young. So all of that was just part of the fun of going to Deadwood and all the other things, as you know, that you can do in Deadwood, South Dakota.
Like pan for gold and have your grandfather think you're going to get a gold nugget, and then the investment is worth it, but you get a floating flake. Whenever I first talked to him, we talked about a pretty badass road trip that my grandparents set up. We went from Louisiana all the way cut through west to Amarillo because my grandfather really wanted to see the car graveyard for some weird reason, that little monument with the cars stuck in the ground.
Sure,
and
I know it.
Went to the Painted Desert and Petrified Forest, got myself a little piece of petrified wood from the thing, went up to Kanab, Utah, stayed in the same hotel that Frank Sinatra spent. I don't know, Elvis Presley was there too.
Wow.
Went to the Boulder Dam, which was cool to see the inner workings of a dam.
Yeah.
and then cut up through Mount Rushmore, where my grandparents were incredibly disappointed by how small it is. And for anybody who doesn't know, Mount Rushmore is literally just a small sculpture on the side of a mountain, and you really have to be creative to imagine how big it is. And then we cut down a deadwood, and we went to the saloon, and everything. For anybody who's never been there, it's still staged as if the game that they played never stopped. You'll see the dead man's hand laying on the table. You can
Yeah.
go up to Boot Hill and see the grave sites for Calamity Jane and the Reverend and Wild Bill. And I think we
Yeah.
ended that by going to Little Bighorn. We went to Little Bighorn.
Wow. I've never been.
It's a plain. That's all it is.
Yeah.
There's no like
Yeah.
stand-in actors or anything.
Yeah.
Went to the Mitchell Corn Palace, which is a palace made
Oh,
of
yeah.
corn.
That's impressive.
And
That's
then
something to see.
we wanted to go to Graceland, but my grandfather literally said, he's like, I'm not paying that much for Prusilla's lip fillers. And then we went back home. He's a very class. He's got the wit of he's a witty man.
He sounds very entertaining indeed.
So yeah, I love those road trips, and I would love the opportunity to do that with my own kids. We have plans. There's a route you can take to hit every single national park in the
Wow.
contiguous USA, right? Outside of
Wow.
the one in Hawaii. And I think I'd
Yes.
like to do that.
That would be great.
And if you like traveling, I know I suggested the ferry from Bellevue to Anchorage, but if you ever get a chance to go up to Canada and cut through the Alaskan Highway 1, that's a
I
beautiful
have
drive.
heard. Yeah.
Gorgeous drive.
That
Just
would
don't do it in
be
winter because it's not safe during the winter.
No.
I'd go during the summer, where the only thing you got to worry about is the mosquitoes, because they're the national bird of that region.
Right. Or fires, sadly.
Fires. Well, fire. A lot of people don't like fire because they're like, they think it's destructive, but it's very important to the circle of life for those
Oh,
forests.
absolutely.
So,
No, I
but
understand
it
that.
stinks because it'll
But
take everything
that's
else out.
fine. Yeah. I mean, it having been, we've been receiving smoke from fires north and south of us for the last few years. And this year wasn't too bad, thank God. But when it gets bad, I mean, you can't go outdoors. It's horrible, horrible. But no, I understand that. Yeah, it's very interesting. Did you read The Overstory by Richard Powers?
I have not.
You should read it. It's all about trees, and it's all about, the extent to which forests take care of themselves and a lot of the people and their relationships to trees. Great, great book. I'm reading it right now and just loving it.
The book that really got me excited to go to Alaska was Hatchet.
Oh, I just picked that up.
Yeah, Hatchet.
I literally just got it. I ordered it and it just arrived a couple of days ago, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's about the kid that gets it's in a crash,
Yep, he's in a plane crash. He
and he's only
befriends a
got a
skunk,
hatchet
and he's
gotta
got a hatchet.
survive,
Yeah.
right? Unbelievable. That is so cool. Wow.
It's a
Very,
great
very
book.
cool.
It was
Yeah.
one of our mandatory reading stuff as a kid. So when my kids come in, like, you ever read Hatchet? I was like, yes, a lot, like 3 times.
I didn't because it was after my time.
So one of your earliest film / other things, you did The Beans of Egypt. You played Warren Olson. You were a drunk in Georgia, and then you were
Yes.
Professor Friedman in Delivered.
Friedman, yes, I was murdered in that.
And then I guess Nowheresville as well was another one.
Oh yes, Nowhere's Row. That was I don't remember a lot about that. I just remember that I spent a lot of time with a lovely local actress here, who now lives, Sally Smythe, who now lives down in LA. And we played a husband and wife, and we had a great time hanging out together. I mean, it's people don't understand the extent to which you often have no idea what the whole picture is because you just go in and you do your little bit in it. And chances are I think I've always had a whole script to be able to look at, not that it's been all that necessary. My work has been fairly small in most of these films, but I read all the scripts and stuff. And for me, it's just, I love being on set. I think it's my favorite thing to do because, like a lot of things like voice work, it's the kind of a job where you get it right once and then you move on. May take a number of takes, but once you got it, you never have to worry about that again, as opposed to being on stage where you rehearse for a month, if you're lucky these days. And then you have to repeat the same performance for, again, a month if you're lucky, 8 times a week. It's a different thing. And I'm not doing theater any longer, just because it began to feel a bit like a straitjacket. And the money is terrible. The thing that I loved the most was the thing that, of course, paid the worst. So,
So after those early years, you did a lot of creative directing for ACT Theater and Seattle Shakespeare Company. What was your roles in that, and how did that transition into getting the opportunities for doing video game voice acting roles?
well, actually, it was the acting more than the directing. I was the artistic director of the A Contemporary Theater, ACT, for 5 years. I've directed at Seattle Shakes. I've directed at pretty much every theater in Seattle over the course of my time, as well as directing all over the country. I've directed like 180 professional productions. But I went to Seattle on a whim to see a friend in 1975. And before I was to take off, I drove, and the friend of mine who was living in Seattle said, "There's a company out here called the Empty Space Theater. They're looking for actors. Do you want me to get you an audition?" And I had been thinking I was headed to the Twin Cities because I'd gone to school there for a couple of years. I knew people who were there. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to audition sooner or later. Sure, get me an audition. I got it. I was asked to join a company that had one more year to exist before it was disbanded, but the theater kept going. I did my first directing there, but I was also acting. Like, that first year, I think I did 6 shows, something like that. Just went from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. It was great. And then after that, I just kept working. I mean, I remember vividly there was one point where I had 3 weeks with no work, and I ended up going and boxing telephones at a telephone store, which you used to do when you would, get your telephone for your house. And other than that, I kept working, which was great. And it was while I was working in at the Empty Space, right at the beginning, that I was seen by people who produce commercials in the area here and asked if I would do them, not audition initially, just, will you come do some commercials? It's like, sure, you know, and that's how my voiceover career got started. And so for a number of years, I got my work because people just kept telling other people about me. And the studios would sort of throw me in the local studios that were casting would, give me a call and ask me to come to audition for things. And I did. Um, and it really wasn't until I'd been doing it, gosh, probably a decade, maybe longer, that I ended up getting an agent. Um, and I had been with that agent until this past year, right? Something like that, for the entire time. And I also have agents in New York, but that's how I got into voice acting. And one of the jobs I went to audition for was a video game called Pajama Sam. There was a period of time where there were all these companies doing video games here in the Seattle area. You mentioned Sierra, obviously. Microsoft was doing things. Humongous, I believe, produced Pajama Sam, Freddy Fish, and Spy
They
Fox,
did
is it?
Spy Fox. They did Backyard Baseball. They did Freddy Fish. They did tons of games that were just educational enough to really
Right,
pull in and make kids
right.
feel
And
comfortable at a cost
I
that was
think,
effective. That was
I
the
think I
thing that
did
mattered.
a bunch of those.
Yeah,
I
you're
did
you're a
Freddy Fish.
toaster in
Yeah,
Pajama Sam.
I was a lion, I think, at one point.
General
Uh,
Beatfoot.
yeah, I did a bunch of it. Was great just doing silly voices, like the cartoons I'd grown up loving.
And I can't forget
So
Putt Putt. Putt Putt.
Putt Putt,
Yeah,
yeah, that's right. I did Putt Putt. I'd forgotten that.
yeah. Putt Putt
Um,
joins the circus, which I
that's it.
haven't
That's
played
where I
that one
played the
yet.
animals. That's where I played the lion, and I think I might have been I might have been an elephant. I don't remember. But it was, it was great. So I love doing that kind of stuff. And I remember very vividly, I got an audition we were talking about this game, Phantasmagoria. And I auditioned for it. I didn't get the first one. I would eventually get cast in the second one, but turn it down because I had a chance to go off and do a play, you know. But that was when I got interested in computers because I'd always thought, well, I'll never be able to figure out computers. It's just way too hard for an old guy like me in my 40s or something. Even younger, I guess. And but after doing Phantasmagoria, I thought I should learn something about computers, and that's when I got one and started to play the games myself, like The Seventh Guest and Phantasmagoria and The 11th Hour, and Myst is the one that absolutely
This is one of my favorite games ever.
blew my mind. Well, it's the most amazing. It's one of the most amazing games ever.
It's important. It was one of the first, if not the first CD-ROM
Yep.
based games.
Yep.
And I tell people every time, they're like, how do I play this? I was like, well, Myst is technically known as what the hell does this button do the game. But that
Yeah.
you have to use those extra brain functions to just
You know nothing. You're
yourself.
dropped into an environment, you know nothing, and it's all about figuring out what the story is. It was mind-blowing. I would, I would sit down, I'd look at the clock, see that it was like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd look down, I'd play for a little bit, or what seemed like a little bit. I'd look back up and it'd be 5:30. It's like, what? I was so sucked into that game. An amazing game.
Which ones have you played by off the top of your head? Have you played them all?
Of what?
Myst?
No, I've just played Myst. I didn't play Ribbon.
Oh my gosh,
Oh,
Riven is
yeah,
so
but
good. My
I know,
favorite
and
one
the
is
thing
3.
that's interesting.
Exile is great. Savidro, if you do get a chance to play 3, Savidro, out of all 800, 900 plus video games I played, streamed, taught
Really?
people about, he is the best character that I've ever, the most evolved antagonist I've ever seen.
Well,
Just wholesome.
there's a very interesting connection here, and that is that, and I just found this out a year ago. I was sitting and chatting with Marty O'Donnell. We were at a fan convention, and he talked about he was doing commercials in Chicago, and a friend of his had a son, and the son had come back from someplace, and he had this new game that he was, working that he'd worked on, and he offered to let Marty play it. It turned out it was Myst. And that's when Marty O'Donnell, who'd been a musician and done music and produced commercials, said, "Who are these guys? Can I get their address, or their phone number?" And he got in touch and he said, I want to work with you guys. I'll do anything, which is what led to him doing music for Ribbon. And then, of course, that got him into the games more and more and led eventually to Halo.
I would. It's been a dream to talk to the Miller brothers, but they're really hard. They're very private, and I respect
Ah,
that.
yeah.
But
But
I
oh
don't
my
know if you know,
God.
they're still making games. They're making badass games too. Firmament and Abduction.
Yeah.
Myst came out in VR with an Unreal. I don't know if you're big. I'm not big into VR because I get motion sickness. But
I've not done that.
they
That
have
would
it
be
to
a
where you can
great
walk
game to
around.
do it, though.
Yeah, well, you can just walk around and you're just surrounded. You're in VR doing everything with your hands that you would use a point and click. A lot of
Oh my
people call
God.
Myst One a PowerPoint simulator because it is slides, but
Yeah.
you didn't care back then. That was It was groundbreaking, and
It was wild.
it's a wonderful series. But Savidro was played. I don't know if you ever worked with Brad Dourif. Brad
Dorif,
Dourif.
the actor, no, but I know who he is very, very well.
So he played Savidro. He plays the antagonist in 3.
Brad Dourif plays Billy, the young kid in because he was originally like a very young actor. He was in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson.
I knew
That
him as
movie.
Grim and Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings.
Yes, and he also, I think he's in the first Dune, and it got to a point where he became, isn't he also Chucky in Child's
I don't.
Play?
I'd have to double check. He's got a wide. I know that
Yeah,
he was in Star Trek. He was in Star Trek Voyager.
he worked with a company in New York called the Circle Rep, where other actors in the company included Jeff Daniels and William Hurt, and Lindsay
Mhm.
Krause, who is David Mamet's wife, and then she was in The Verdict with Paul Newman. I mean, they had tons of sensational actors who've continued working there, I mean, beyond that company, which unfortunately is no longer in existence. He's an amazing.
Gotcha.
Wise Blood, John Huston's film. He plays the lead in that.
You have a lot of experience under your belt with like Close Combat 3, The Russian Front, Spy Fox, all this awesome games from Humongous, games that were part of my childhood. And I think what's so insane is that when it comes to voice acting, if you're not the main character, a lot of people just don't realize that you're there, that you're in the background. And then once they talk to you and they hear you, they'll go back and they'll play all these old games and be like, I knew it. That's him. Same for the guy who was the dad in the Steve Urkel show. I don't remember what it is, but he was Shredder. I didn't know that.
Oh, I don't think I did either.
Yeah, he was Shredder. He also did tons of NES commercials. He was the head for Akari Warriors, the skull no, Cabal.
Yeah.
My bad. And you can hear it, and you're like, oh, that's him. That's him. And when you got into Halo, were you playing the games? Because it sounds like you really.
No, because the game hadn't been. There were no games. Halo was the first game, and I was with it from the very beginning back in 2001. Went through the audition process. The way that all worked out was that Marty O'Donnell had come from Chicago, and working as commercial producer and then starting to do games. He recognized that Chicago had an amazing group of actors who lived and worked there, and so he used a lot of them for things. When he came out to Seattle, because that was part of the deal with Microsoft, is that Bungie would relocate to here. He decided he had heard that Seattle also had a terrific talent pool of actors, had a lot of stage stuff happening at that time. And so he brought in just tons of people for the first game. And the men all had the same audition, and the women all had the same audition. The women did Cortana's lines, and then the men all did Master Chief and an alien. I remember doing an alien. And then everybody who auditioned at the end of the audition had to scream like they were being, murdered horribly by whatever the antagonist was going to be. Nobody knew what this game was. The only direction I got when I auditioned for Master Chief was think Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. All right. So yeah, sort of like that. And and then the next thing I tell this story too often, but the next thing that happened was I was told by my agent, congratulations, you got cast as Master Chief. And I went, oh, okay. I didn't know what Master Chief was. Nobody knew
Just one of
anything
the most
about
iconic, characters.
but nobody knew anything about the game. So time goes on. All my friends are going in. David Scully, who plays Sergeant Johnson. Jen has been in doing Cortana. All the folks, and almost everything was local. There were some folks from Chicago, but they'd all gone in and recorded, and I hadn't heard a word. So I said to my agent one day, "Can you check and find out what's going on? I'm getting a little nervous." And she said, "Sure." Called back a little later, said, "Well, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is that Marty evidently got cold feet about having you play Master Chief because he hasn't worked with you. So he's decided to work with an actor he knew in Chicago, somebody named Steve Downs." Well, that, of course, was absolutely the right choice. She said, "The good news is they want you to be the announcer for the game." And I thought, well, that doesn't sound very interesting, but it's like, sure. I mean, I'd never say no to work. So I went in that first day, and it was unusual because there was security at the front desk. I never really had to deal with that. I mean, like real security. And we went back into this big room. I met Marty, and he introduced me to all the folks working on the game. They all had their little computers at their various desks, and they were doing visual stuff. And he showed me a Halo ring, and I had no idea what that was, but it looked cool. And I saw like a warthog driving across a landscape, and it's like, oh, this is amazing, I guess,
This isn't Mist. I'm
It's
disappointed.
it was actually like Myst. It was sort of more hyper real than a lot of games were. You know how games used to be very flat, like Mario Brothers. I mean, Mario Brothers until it became Super Mario Brothers, and then suddenly, it was very 3D. This is, sort of at that point. And then we went in to record, and he said, uh, what are we going to do about this voice? And I was like, oh, what do you want? And he said, can you do Monster Truck Rally? Monster Truck Rally. He said, okay, good. Now pull that back. He said, didn't you did the alien too? And I said, yeah. All right, then add some of that alien that you've done, and we started putting all this stuff together. And before you knew it, we had something to start working with. And I went right into doing, double kill, triple kill, overkill, that kind of stuff. and recorded for days, it seems, in retrospect, because there was a lot to record. And I went back a couple of times over the course of the next year. So we must have started in 2000. Well, I don't think so. Actually, it was 2001, but early in the year. And then because I know I went back once or twice, and then the game came out in the fall, and it was like, okay. But I didn't know anything about it. I had no idea that it was a big success until, yeah, till 4 years later or so, whenever it was, I get a call from my agent saying, "Hey, they're doing a sequel to Halo, and they want you back." And it was like, "Oh, okay, great," you know. And eventually, I began to realize that I was in this monster success, but I didn't know that originally at all.
This is the end of part 1 of the interview. I should be releasing the continuation of this either today or tomorrow, and I do encourage everyone to check out part 2 as soon as it drops, so you can hear more of Mr. Jeff's awesome story. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and as always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.